I did find a interesting couple of comments in the Talmud. So pulling them together is pretty interesting. So let me just start off by going to, excuse me, this thing here. What we're going to look at, there's many Essenes, and we say that John the Baptist was, etc., but there's actually people that are named Essenes, and Pharisees and Sadducees and that kind of stuff. But there was a guy named Menachem, or Menachem. It's pronounced different ways, but and you'll see it spelled a lot of different ways for some weird reason. But basically, we have the CH here is a hard CH German-like K, or a Hebrew K. And sometimes it'll be spelled with an H. So instead of Menachem, it becomes Menachem or Hem. And then sometimes you'll see it with the H dropped out. So it's just something else. Sometimes in Hebrew, the N and the N's change. So anyway, but there's a guy, we just call him Menachem, was in a scene. Now here it is in Acts 13. This is pretty interesting. It says in Acts 13, this is when prophets came down from Antioch to separate Paul, or pray about it, but then they end up separating Paul and Barnabas and sending them off as missionaries. So this is what it says here. Now, there were in the church that was in Antioch certain prophets and teachers, as Barnabas and Simeon, that was called Niger, Lucius the Cyrene, and Manaen, which was or had been brought up in the house of Herod the Tetrarch. So this is what I want you to see. And again, the CH is dropped out. Otherwise, it would be Menachem. And of course, the N somehow has changed. When you go through multiple languages, things get really weird. But there's a guy named Menachem who had been brought up in the house of Herod the Tetrarch. So somehow, when he was a child or a young man, he was in the house of Herod for some reason. It says, and they ministered to the Lord, and Saul was there, which is Paul. As they ministered to the Lord, they fasted, and the Holy Spirit said, separate me, Barnabas and Saul, for the work thereof I have called them. And when they had fasted and prayed, they laid hands on them and sent them away. So you'll see in other places in Acts, Agabus is a main person in this. But there are always a school of prophets from Antioch that come down to do something. So in this case, I don't know anything really of Simon or Lucius, but Menachem I knew a little bit about and found a few other interesting things. So with that in mind, let's go to what the Talmud says. This is pretty interesting. You probably remember, if you've studied this stuff, that there was a leader of the Sanhedrin for a while, and then he would resign or die or something, and there'd be a new leader of the Sanhedrin. It was just one at a time, whoever led it. And at a certain point, they call this the period of the Tanin, when you've got two. And so it was customary to have two rulers at the time. This all started way back when we had the Pharisees and the Sadducees become powers, and at one point they tried to kill each other, and there was a civil war. And the Essenes had stepped out of the situation, being told by the Lord to just go down to Egypt, stay there for a while, specifically until Rome would step in, fulfill the prophecies in Daniel 11, and then that would create a peace. And Rome did. Rome basically said, we don't care what you worship, we don't care how you worship, unless it's breaking Roman law. And of course, if you pay taxes, and then you're okay. So when Rome stepped in to control that, that was the time for the Essenes to go back into Israel. And so this happened at that point. So now Rome steps in 64 BC. So from sometime thereafter in 64 BC, the Essenes would send people back into Israel, and they would create what we call Qumran, was their headquarters. They called it New Damascus. And so from there, they would start preaching and teaching, and they led quite a revival, according to the scrolls. So anyway, so this is going on then, and the Essenes come back in, And then, of course, what Rome does is they come in at first, they stop the battles, the bloodshed, and they decide, I forget which one's worse, but first, but the Essenes or the Pharisees, one of them, and they say, okay, you guys are the rulers. And it didn't work so well. So then they remove them and they say, go to the other guys like the Sadducees and say, you guys are the rulers. That doesn't work. And so they keep trying to figure things out. And eventually they come up with the bright idea, leave off the Pharisees, leave off the Sadducees and any other Jewish party, and we will put in an Idumean as king of the Jews. That'd be Herod, an Edomite, in other words. So he's not really Jewish. He's definitely not part of, let me make sure that everything's going on here. Looks like everything's, okay, going well. Just want to make sure everyone hears me. So anyway, the idea of giving it to somebody neutral, in other words. So Herod not being Pharisee, Sadducee, Essene, anything like that. Hopefully he can control things. That didn't work either. And they keep going back and forth until eventually, so anyway, it looks like eventually they get to the point where they try lots of things. It doesn't work. There's massive bloodshed. There's the Bar Kokhba rebellion, and they finally just dissolve Israel. So what's going on here? This is up in the time of Paul. So 50 to 60 AD, probably 60, 61, something like that. And Paul gets set apart for the gospel. There's multiple missionary trips that Paul does. Then he goes to Rome and eventually is executed. So in this case, though, we want to see all these different people. So the situation is with these two guys, after Rome steps in, one of the things that Rome tries is to try to put a Sadducee and a Pharisee together as running the Sanhedrin and make them cooperate. That was another thing that Rome thought, well, if we do this, then maybe everything will be fine. So at this point, then, we have the ruler of the Pharisees under persecution goes to Egypt, and this is about 80 BC with the Civil War. And when that's over, Empress Salome comes to power. She's actually the sister of the guy that heads the Pharisees. The Pharisees come back in and basically do a slaughter of other groups. And then there is this problem that arises. Well, while he's in Egypt, going away from the persecution, there are these two guys that are actually Assyrians, Shammai and Albatron. And those are the guys mentioned by the church fathers a lot. They're the ones that started the time of the reinterpretation of Scripture. Well, anyway, they come back with him, and he puts them as the two heads of the Sanhedrin, even though they were novices, and even though you're not supposed to do any kind of a convert, still somehow they're heads of the Sanhedrin. Well, when they retire, we get Shammai and Hillel. And you probably remember the whole idea of Hillel being one of the greatest rabbis ever. Hillel's main disciple was Gamaliel. Gamaliel's main disciple was the Apostle Paul. So we're getting up in that time period around the time of Christ. And so, but the other guy, he was a Pharisee, basically. The other guy's a Sadducee. And so what we know is Shammai and Hillel, and then when they retire, it's kind of bought out by Annas and Caiaphas. And so that's all we know. That's the official line. But the one thing we didn't know is that before Shammai entered the picture, there was another guy. And this is what's really interesting. So going back to Menachem, this is what we found in the Talmud. So this is from the Babylonian Talmud, Haggah 16, A and B. And it basically, there's a comment, okay, in the first part. And it says Hillel and Menachem did not disagree in regard to this issue. And the whole issue was, you know how we say, if you accept, it's the Calvinists will say, if you accept the Lord as your Savior, then you're doing something, and that's a work. And so that's kind of like a work salvation. It was kind of the same kind of an argument here. he was saying that if you lay hands, some the Sadducees, if you lay hands on the animal and then you sacrifice it, you're doing something before you sacrifice it, so it amounts to a work. And the sacrificial animal has never been worked, like plow or something. And so the other guys say, no, just me laying my hand on it, praying on it, is not it working. And so there's this kind of a stupid debate. But anyway, so the point is that Hillel and Menachem did not agree on, or did not disagree. They both agreed that laying your hand on the animal and praying is not a work. Okay. So it goes on and said, Menachem departed from his post, and Shammai entered in his stead. So in other words, this is telling us that there's a missing piece to the story. Originally, it was Hillel and Menachem, not Hillel and Shammai. And so something has happened. Menachem kind of disappears, and nobody wants to talk about Menachem because who knows where he went or what he did. So this kind of thing. So when we get to the second part of this, the question arises, where did Menachem go? What happened to him? Because, I mean, you don't become leader of the Sanhedrin and just decide, I'm going fishing one day. Something happened. He didn't die, or it would have just been recorded that he died and went on. So this goes on and says, it is taught in the Mishnah, Menachem departed and Shammai entered. So Hillel has stayed this whole time. So it was Hillel and Menachem. He departed and Shammai took his place. And so the question is, where did Menachem go? Where did he depart? And one of the rabbis says he departed and went astray. And this particular word for going astray means to become a heretic. But it's the kind of heretic, later on it's called Menin, but it's the kind of heretic that the Jews won't like you. But of course, Jews at this point can't do anything about it because Rome is ruling. But if you're the kind of heretic that Rome doesn't like either, then you can be hunted down and killed. We see this with the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul gets permission from the Sanhedrin and from the Romans, everybody he needs permission from, to go hunt Christians and bring them back in chains. So you can't just do one party or the other. So what this is saying is if he departs and he becomes a Menin, something that Rome is thinking is bad, or that the Jews are thinking is bad, there's only one group that's like that. You stay Jewish, but you depart from what the Pharisees think is the law of the elders, oral Torah, and the Romans are thinking that you are some weird apostate kind of cult, dangerous to Rome. So in this area, there's only one really religion that does that, and that's being a Christian. And so it's really interesting to me to see this. This is, there's a little bit of debate just by looking at this manuscript, because they don't want to tell you too much of what happened. That again makes me think Christian. But anyway, later on we find out more information. So at this point, it says that it was taught in the Mishnah that Menachem departed, Shammai entered. So now it's Hillel and Shammai, which is the normal stuff we all know. Where did he go? He departed and went astray. So become a heretic, or in other words, a believer in Messiah. Therefore, the Mishnah did not wish to delve into the details of this case. They're saying we don't want to talk about, evil people. But they do all the time, except when a Jew who knows the law becomes a follower of Messiah. Then they usually don't want to talk about this case. So again, that's really interesting. So it goes on and says, Rava said, he departed for the king's service. So this is interesting, this part right here. So this could be a guy that says, I'd make more money if I stopped being a pastor and be a senator in the government. And somebody might do that, So he could just stop being in the Sanhedrin and go work for the king, have more power, even better able to serve his people. It might be a good thing all around. But there's this whole point of being a heretic, going astray in there. So it's not like they're saying, hey, you're a good guy, go do this. Something happened. He became what they consider heretical, but at the same time, he went into the king's service. Now, we don't know what king it is yet, whether that's Caesar or Herod or whomever, but he departed for the king's service. He received a post from the king and had to leave the court. It is also taught, that Menachem departed for the king's service, and 80 pairs of students dressed in silk robes left with him to work for the king, and they no longer studied Torah. This is really interesting. At first, you'd think if they're no longer studying Torah, then they don't care anything about scriptures. They have really apostatized. But in this case, they become a heretic, not just a non-believing Jew, or a Jew that would leave this and get so caught up in the government that he has no time to study, is not coming to synagogue. But this has the whole connotation of something else. So what this looks like to me, and we'll see what Josephus says in a minute, but what this looks like to me is that Menachem was one of the leaders of the Sanhedrin. He departed because he became a believer in Messiah, so they don't want to talk about it. And somewhere along the line, when he departed, he went into the king's court. So he was friends with probably Herod or Caesar, only really kings in the area, so it's probably Herod. And when he did, he took students with him. So students that studied with him. So he was teaching the law, that kind of stuff. So we've got 80 pairs, that's 160 people, dressed in white or silk robes. And people look at this and say a silk robe, it just means you're wealthy. But a silk is usually white. And so white robes would denote Essenes rather than the other way around. So that's really interesting. So from this, the one thing we know for sure is he's part of the Sanhedrin. And the other part is kind of speculation, because they're really trying to not let you see what's going on. So that brings us to Josephus. And this is from Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews, book 15, section 10, or chapter 10, section 5. So, okay, so this says, now there was one of these Essenes whose name was Menachem, and he had this testimony. So this is a very famous Essene. And as we can see, he's probably the guy mentioned in the Gematria as being someone who was ruling the Sanhedrin, became heretical, a believer in Messiah. So his name was Menachem. He had this testimony that he not only conducted, remember the Essenes are supposed to be healers, live double lifespans because of the herbal medicine. They're supposed to be 100% accurate prophets, and they know the scriptures. So this says, this is his testimony that he not only conducted his life in an excellent manner, so he was very moral, he was a very godly man, but he also had foreknowledge of future events given to him by God also. That's very common with Essenes. It never happens with Pharisees and Sadducees. And it's the same today. I mean, if you don't believe in the gifts of the Spirit, you're not going to be told anything, because you wouldn't pay attention if God did tell you something in a dream or whatever. So those kind of things happen. It's amazing to me that back then, the Pharisees and the Sadducees would say the gifts don't happen anymore. Nobody gets healed. No, God doesn't talk to people or anything like that. But everybody knew that the Essenes had the gifts, and they transferred to the Christians. The early church father says at a certain point, you'd have to be, once the Messiah comes, you can't be a non-believer and have the Holy Spirit. So it's interesting. And then today people will say, well, the gifts don't happen. I've never seen anybody in my church healed or a word of wisdom or anything like that. Well, go to a Calvary chapel anyway. But he had foreknowledge of future events given to him by God also. And of course, he would be 100% accurate if God is actually talking to him. So this man, Menachem, once saw Herod when he was a child. So I don't know, the word child can mean just like non-adult or adult from a Jewish you basically become an adult at 12. As far as the Jews are concerned, I think it was 18 or something like that in the Roman era. So anyway, he was very young, okay? So he was a child or very, very young, and he saw Herod, and going to school, he saluted him as King of the Jews. But thinking that earlier he did not know him or that he was in jest, he put in his mind that he was but a private man. So you're looking at this guy thinking he's a nutty kid. Hail, King of the Jews. Yeah, I'm just a guy. Just cool it. Because if you're not King of the Jews and a bunch of people start saying you're king, you could get into some really good trouble, you know. So he's saying, shh, shut up, kid. I'm just a private guy. So this is what's going on. So, but Menachem smiled to himself, clapped on him on his backside, and said, however that be, you will be king, and it will begin thy reign happily, for God finds thee worthy of it. This kid comes up and just hauls off and slaps him and says, remember the day that I came and slapped you. Remember that. So he says, Menachem smiled to himself and clapped him on the backside and said, however this be, you will be king, and you will begin your reign happily, for God finds you worthy of it. And it says right here, remember the blows that Menachem hath given thee as a signal of the change of your fortune. When you look back on it, you're going to think that day when the prophet came up and slapped you and said, you're going to be king. You'll notice when you think back, that was the day it all started. So it's really interesting here. So it goes on, I'm going to run up here. It says, now at the time, Herod did not attend to what Menachem said. Stupid kid. And he had no hopes of such advancement. But after a little while afterward, when he was so fortunate to be advanced to the dignity of king, and remember what's going on is you try Pharisees, they try to kill people. So you try Sadducees, they try to kill people. You go back and forth. The Essenes are kind of out of the picture. So the idea is let's pick somebody who's not a Pharisee or a Sadducee and put them in. Maybe that'll work. So you grab the first guy that's there. This guy seems to know what's going on. He's an Edomian. Everybody hates him. Equal opportunity hate. Maybe he can rule good. So all of a sudden, because of that, somebody somewhere, some Roman centurion or Caesar or somebody makes this decision, and boom, you're king. So shortly after that is when it happened. Now, look at this. This is interesting. Okay, and it was in the height of his dominion, when he was in the height of his dominion, he sent for Menachem. So think about this. So you've got this kid that comes along and says, you're going to be king. Remember that, and remember that the day that happened, and then you'll notice all this stuff started, and it did. And now he's king, and he's thinking about it. How does a kid know that? It's got to be a prophet or psychic or something. Maybe I should find this guy and talk to him, right? So he says he sent for Menachem and asked him how long he should reign. So this is kind of a test. So you really knew, and unless you just heard it from somebody, if somehow you're a prophet or whatever, tell me how long I'm going to reign. You know, and Menachem did not tell him the full length of his reign. Wherefore, upon his silence, he asked him further whether he should reign 10 years or not. And he replied, yes, 20, nay, 30 years. So at first he didn't want to tell him anything. Not that he didn't know, but he just didn't want to say it. And he kind of pressed him. At least 10 years? Actually, you're going to reign over 30 years. And that was correct. He did reign over 30 years. And he goes on and says, he did not assign the just and determinate limit of his reign. He didn't give him the exact number. Herod was satisfied with these replies, and he gave Menachem his hand and dismissed him. And from that time he controlled, or continued rather, to honor all the Essenes. So this is pretty interesting. So you've got Essenes in Herod. Remember when Herod, when the wise men came and they asked him, where's the Christ child to be born? And he's like, I have no clue. So he calls people that's in his care, and they say it's, scripture's obvious, Micah 5, it's Bethlehem is where he's born, and then all that stuff happens. Of course, he's beginning to turn evil by that time. So, and Josephus goes on and says, we have thought it proper to relate these facts to our readers, how very strange they may be, and to declare what has happened among us, because many of these Essenes have, by their excellent virtue, been thought worthy of this knowledge of divine revelations. So this is just one place where he's talking about Essenes, but he's talking about a specific Essene named Menachem. So Essenes were known for long lifespans. They were known for their herbal medicine. They were called healers. They're just followers of the Zadok way, the Zadok priests. And Essene is a Greek term meaning healer. So that's how that is used. So in this case, this is interesting. So if we go back to the top, look at this again. He departed for the king's service with 80 pairs of students dressed in silk robes and left him. So again, I don't think I have anything past that. Oh, okay. Yeah, this is Matthew. Just to say this, when Jesus was born in Bethlehem in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, where is to be born the King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. So when Herod the king heard all these things, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. So when he had gathered the chief priests and the scribes of the people together, he demanded of them where the Christ should be born. And they said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet, and this is from Micah 5, that thou, Bethlehem, the land of Judah, art not least among the princes of Judah, for out of thee shall come forth a governor who shall rule my people Israel. Now this is saying that it was the chief priests and the scribes. Now, scribes sometimes can refer to Essenes, sometimes can refer to just the people who make the contracts, non-religious, just buying and selling, marriages, stuff like that. And there's also a religious order of scribes. So that word means a lot of different things. The scribes are usually ones that didn't pay attention to history. So they were not like Essenes. Chief priests might be the high priest or someone from his court. Now, again, if it's an old high priest, like Menachem, or chief of the Sanhedrin, that would be pretty interesting. So this may or may not be the same people, but it just kind of shows you what's going on. So going back up to the top, we'll look at this again. So if he was a young child when Herod started ruling and ruled 30 years, and then you have Herod Antipas, and then you go on, and so this kind of stuff. So if he was even 20 years old, plus 30, plus another 30 would be 60, 70, 80. He would be about 80 years old, maybe 85, something like that, when Paul, and this might even be earlier, before they started the missionary journeys, but 80 nonetheless. And if most Essenes lived to be 110 to 120, this could very easily be the same guy. So we tend to look at that and think, yeah, if we're going to die at 60, that's not him, but double lifespan. So let's look at this again. It says, Acts 13, 1 through 3, in the church that was at Antioch, there were certain prophets and teachers, people 100% accurate in prophecy, Barnabas, Simeon, who was called Niger, Lucius the Cyrene, and Manaen or Menachem, which had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch. So Josephus tells us that Menachem was a child when he came, that just means young, or, in the process of still growing up, when he came to Herod and gave him the prophecy. So it's really interesting to me. You have someone like, Well, you've got a lot of people probably in the Sanhedrin and in the governing body and a lot of other people that believe in Jesus the Messiah, but won't lift a finger because they'll lose everything. I think of Nicodemus, who came to Jesus by night and wanted to know and apparently believed, but wouldn't dare do anything lest he lose his position. In this case, you got a guy named Menachem, who was ruler of the Sanhedrin, that said, I'm going to go follow Messiah. Well, why? What's going on? Never mind. Bye-bye. He gave it all up. It's just interesting. There are people like that. And he gives it up, and we see him some 60 years later. He's one of the main prophets in Antioch. Apparently, that's where the school of the prophets was for a time afterwards, up there with Agabus and the other guys. And he comes down specifically to see Saul and Barnabas. And so if Saul had studied under Gamaliel, who studied under Hillel, and Menachem would have been there with Hillel, everybody knew everybody. Yeah, but everybody knew that Menachem was a priest. He was an Essene, filled with the Spirit, obviously. And then he comes to lay hands on Saul. Very, very interesting story. So we can kind of see this. And again, lots of Essene stuff. And if you are an Essene, you are a Christian. It's just one of those things. So really, really fascinating to look at this. So we have evidence in Acts 13 of Menachem. I didn't realize, though, that the Talmud had said that he was a ruler of the Sanhedrin at one time. So I just thought that was really cool.